Hi, everyone. I wanted to thank you on behalf of the Ecology Action Center for joining our live panel and discussion on the path forward for marine species at risk in Canada. We'd like to give you an overview of species at risk assessment process in Canada, talk a little bit about why marine species are unique and what are the challenges in using the Species at Risk Act to recover them. We're going to also go into a case study on bluefin tuna as it presents an opportunity for managing species at risk in Canada. We'd like to offer you the opportunity to write any questions you have in the comments, and we'll address these at the end of the panelists' talks. So now I'd like to introduce the four panelists. So first we have Alan Sinclair, and he has a long history of working in fisheries science. Currently, he's the co-chair of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada's Marine Fish Subcommittee. So thank you, Alan, for joining us. Next, we have Dr. Julia Baum, and she's an associate professor at the University of Victoria and is currently a Pew Marine Fellow. She focuses on the ecology and conservation of marine populations and ecosystems. Welcome, Julia. And next we have Dr. Andre Bustani. He's a research scientist at Duke University and a senior NERIS principal investigator at the Montgomery Bay Aquarium. And he studies pelagic fish and fisheries, such as bluefin tuna, looking at ways to reduce bycatch and improve fishing efficiency. And my name is Katie Schleit, and I'm a senior marine campaign coordinator at the Ecology Action Center. Ecology Action Center is based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, so we have people joining us today from both coasts of Canada. And I work on fisheries management and conservation here with a focus on bluefin tuna, sharks, and forage fish. So I'd like to get the panel started. We're going to start with Alan Sinclair. And he's going to give us an overview of the Species at Risk Act process in Canada, starting with the scientific assessment process, and then talking a little bit about more the political decision-making around listing a species at risk. So I'll turn it over to Alan.
Thanks very much, Katie. I hope I can do all that in 10 minutes. So just a brief overview then of what COSEWIC is. That's the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. So COSEWIC is the scientific authority on conservation status of Canadian wildlife. The organization itself has been around for 40 years, and it was recognized under the Canadian Species at Risk Act when it was instituted in 2003. The membership of COSEWIC includes 2 co-chairs from each of 10 taxonomic subcommittees. So marine fishes is one, but there are 9 others. There are 2 co-chairs from our Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee. Then there are representatives from jurisdictions from all Canadian provinces and territories, and 4 federal ministries, Canadian Wildlife Service, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Parks Canada, and the Canadian Museum of Nature, and then there are 3 non-government science members. In terms of process, the COSEWIC works from a prioritized candidate species list. And these lists began with a general status evaluation for a potential candidate species. And for marine fish species, this was done somewhere around 2005 and 2006. Then any species that are going to be assessed by COSEWIC are presented for prioritization, and so that's to make sure that we're actually spending time looking at things that are do that kind of consideration. And then reports are written under contract. The contracts are managed by Environment and Climate Change Canada, and the co-chairs from the various species subcommittees act as the scientific authorities on those. Each report goes through 3 review cycles that involve the individual subcommittee members as well as the relevant jurisdictional members. In the case of marine fish species, these jurisdictions always include the Canadian Wildlife Service, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and then any province or territory that has interest in the species being assessed. And it typically takes about 18 months for a report to be written and vetted through the COSEWIC process. The assessment criteria that COSEWIC uses are based on those established by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And these criteria are meant to be general enough so that they would apply to all taxa of interest. And there are 5 categories, A, B, C, D, and E. And the A deals with declines in numbers of mature individuals. The B criterion has to do with species with small spatial distributions that are declining. The C has to do with populations numbers that are small and declining. And then there's D, which is very small population sizes. So population size is less than 2,500 individuals. And then there's a ability to do quantitative analysis like population viability analysis. The majority of marine fish species are assessed with the A criterion, decline in number of mature individuals. And I could say in general that marine fish species are considered to be very data rich. We have quite a bit of information. And then from those criteria emerge recommendations on conservation status, and these fall into a number of categories. There's extinct or extirpated, endangered, threatened, special concern, not at risk, or data deficient. The COSEWIC process itself is open and transparent. It's based on internationally accepted practice. The assessment criteria, annual reports, all the completed status reports, candidate species lists, the membership in the committees are all available online and by request for public use. Also, any species that has been assessed as either special concern, threatened, or endangered are required to be assessed again in a 10-year period. And for marine fish now, we are well into the second round of reassessments where species have been around for 10 years. And then the results from COSEWIC assessments are sent to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada on an annual basis. So that's in a very rough nutshell how COSEWIC operates. And then I'll move quickly to the SARA process, and it's really not I don't fully understand it, but I'll just give again a thumbnail sketch. Once the species are assessed by COSEWIC and transmitted to the Minister of Environment, the listing decisions are the responsibility of the Canadian government based on recommendations from the Minister of Environment Canada, who also consults with the Ministers of Fisheries and Oceans and Parks Canada. And the government has 3 options regarding listing. The first is to basically list the species under SARA as recommended. The second option is to refer the assessment back to COSEWIC if for scientific reasons there is some doubt as to the validity of the assessment. And the third option is not to list. If species are listed under the Species at Risk Act, species of special concern require the development of a management plan to improve their status. Species that are listed as endangered or threatened require development of a recovery strategy and an action plan and the protection of critical habitat. And one of the major restrictions here is a restriction on killing of the species. And for marine fish, this means no directed fishing and no sale of those fish. Incidental harm can be permitted through bycatch. For example, unintended capture of fish species in other commercial fisheries can be permitted under the Act. And in fact, this was done for a couple of wolffish species that were grandfathered under SARA when it was first created. So these are possibilities that are often overlooked. Once the minister receives COSEWIC assessments, then there's a period of consultation. And this is a problematic area. I'm sure Dr. Baum will touch on this next. But the overwhelming tendency for marine fish species is basically not to list them. And the reasons that are given for not listing is because of a perceived negative social and economic impact of the listing. And I've read every Canada Gazette rationale for not listing marine fish, And the decisions are mainly justified on what I would consider a flawed cost-benefit argument, where the cost is determined as foregone revenue from all commercial fishing where the species is caught, with no consideration for permitting. And the benefits are simply not evaluated. So I think that's a major flaw in the listing decisions. But I think more disturbing is that there are a huge number of marine fish species that wind up in what I call Sarah limbo, where decisions are simply not taken. And we have reassessed species now on their 10-year cycle that have been sitting in this limbo for over 10 years. I think right now, if I take into consideration the recent decision not to list bluefin tuna and one of the West Coast rockfish species, I think there are 17 species that are stuck in limbo, and there are 40, we call them designatable units, but 40 genetically distinct independent population units that are sitting in this Sarah limbo. The number is quite shocking. Anyway, in terms of changes that I would love to see happen, I think the first obvious one is to require that listing decisions are taken within a specified period of time, something in the range of about a year since, after the COSEWIC assessment is done, that some decision is taken, whether it's to not list or to refer back or whatever. So I'd like to see that happen. The second is that I would really like to see Fisheries and Oceans Canada include the COSEWIC criteria in its precautionary approach framework for managing commercial fisheries. If you look through a lot of the documentation around groundfish species in Canada, COSEWIC is basically completely absent, not even mentioned. You'd tend to think that people are just pretending that we don't exist. But over half of our subcommittee members are either currently working for DFO or have retired. And 4 of the past 6 co-chairs of our committee are former DFO employees, all of which have stock assessment experience, and nobody has a problem in interpreting the criteria that COSEWIC uses to assess conservation status. So I don't think it would be pushing things very much to see COSEWIC criteria implemented in the DFO's precautionary approach framework. And you don't have to look very far within DFO to see where it is being implemented, and that's in the Wild Pacific Salmon Policy document, where COSEWIC is mentioned explicitly, and there are benchmarks that are set with COSEWIC criteria in mind. So I've used up a little bit more than my 10 minutes, but I will now pass the floor over.
Great, thank you so much, Alan, for that useful background information. I think you've teed up, hopefully, Dr. Julia Baum's talk a little bit as well. So I'm going to hand it over to her to talk about a study she did and some of the review of the SARA process for marine species. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Julia. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'm going to assume that you can hear me. Okay, so that was a great overview by Alan of what's really quite a complicated process for management of marine fishes in Canada. And I'm going to talk about some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities for improving the management of marine fishes, and specifically those at risk in Canada. So on the positive side, as I think Alan overviewed really nicely, we have a whole suite of management tools that could be used to effectively manage our marine resources in Canada. So we have the management framework under DFO. We also have the Species at Risk Act. And so I think that sets us up quite nicely, I guess, optimistically, for thinking that we do have the power to effectively manage and effectively rebuild marine fishes in Canada. The problem is that we haven't been actually effectively using the policy tools that we have in place. And so Alan touched on a couple of the challenges, and I'll just give you a few more numbers to go along with that. So in the past couple of years, I've done a couple of analyses looking at how we're managing marine fishes or failing to manage marine fishes in Canada. This has been done with Dr. Susanna Fuller. And one of the things that we found is that of all of the marine fishes in Canada that have been assessed as being at risk by COSEWIC, so this is a purely scientific assessment assessing these species as being special concern or threatened or endangered, fewer than 20% of them have actually been listed on SARA. And so that is rather a shocking result in and of itself. It means that once we know that marine fish species are at a heightened risk of extinction, or we can at least say they are in trouble, they require concerted management and conservation action, we're failing to list them on our Species at Risk Act. One of the even more perverse outcomes or results from that is that you might think, well, maybe we are listing the species that are most at risk, so maybe we're only listing the endangered species or only listing the threatened species. But in Canada, it actually works completely the opposite way. So what we found is that species that are at lower risk, those species that are assessed as being only of special concern, those are the ones that tend to be listed on the Species at Risk Act. Whereas those species, marine fish species that are assessed as being either threatened or endangered, those ones are actually less likely to be listed on our Species at Risk Act. This is a very perverse finding. So what we found is that 3/4 of marine fishes that have been assessed as being endangered have been denied listing on our Species at Risk Act. So this is an act that is really not functioning for marine fishes in Canada. It certainly has the potential to, but what really gets in the way are the socioeconomic concerns that Alan was discussing. Couple of other things that I'll just elaborate on that Alan mentioned as well is that one of the other huge problems is not just that marine fishes in Canada tend to be denied listing on SARA, but I would say that almost as big or potentially a bigger problem is the amount of time that it actually takes for those decisions to be made. So one would hope that once a scientific assessment is made stating that a species is either threatened or endangered, that you would then want to put conservation measures into place quite rapidly to actually facilitate the recovery of those species. Instead, what we find is this completely perverse course of action or a course of inaction, whereby instead of acting quickly, things take a very, very, very long time in Canada. And so what we know is that from the time that a scientific assessment is made and we know that a species is assessed as special concern, threatened, or endangered, it takes on average 3¼ years for a SARA decision to be made. And so that's a very long time. What we need to have is legally binding timelines, and we currently don't have those. So there are sort of loose timelines, loose frameworks in which decisions are meant to be made, but there are no ramifications for not making the decisions within those timeframes, and that's a huge problem. One of the things we know from doing analyses of marine fishes and their capacity for rebuilding is that optimistically, or on the positive side, we know that marine fish populations typically do have the capacity to recover. We know that when fishing pressure is reduced on marine fishes, and it's reduced in a very concerted manner, we know that populations typically can recover, and that they typically can recover fairly quickly, often within 10 years. But what we also know from looking at the trajectory that a lot of different marine fishes take when they've been overfished is that the longer you wait to reduce fishing pressure, not only therefore the longer it takes for them to recover, which is sort of the obvious result, but the other thing we know is that the longer that management waits to reduce fishing pressure, the more uncertain the whole recovery process is. And so what we're doing in Canada by delaying our decisions, we're basically hugely increasing the amount of uncertainty in the recovery process. So I think it's sort of a case of not wanting to make the hard decision that would in the long run actually have a much huger payoff. Instead, we delay making those decisions, which might seem like it's beneficial in the short term because you're not reducing fishing pressure in the short term, but in the long term, you're actually creating many more problems. I think if I just have a couple more minutes, I'll just briefly also touch on a couple of positive aspects. So the analyses that we did were done 2 years ago, and so of course we've had a change in government since then. I just want to briefly touch on some of the positive things that our new government has been doing, because I think we are headed in the right direction. We certainly have more work to do, but we're I think on a positive trajectory. And so one thing that I can say is that earlier this year, our new federal government did make SARA decisions for 15 marine species, so that is positive. Many of them are now going to be listed on the Species at Risk Act. Some recovery plans for at-risk species have been completed. There's mostly been a focus on whales, but this is still process. Prior to that, we had really seen virtually no recovery plans or action plans for at-risk marine species, which is obviously hugely problematic. And we've also seen a commitment of about $20 million to implementing recovery and rebuilding plans, which is also a positive sign. I'll just briefly say that on the international stage, Canada is, of course, a party member to the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is an international treaty that virtually every country in the world, with the glaring exception of the United States, is a party to. It's really the treaty that makes us think about biodiversity conservation, and some of the major targets there are called the Aichi targets. The main Aichi target that has really been getting a lot of press and media coverage in Canada is Aichi Target 11, which is the target that by 2020 we need to have a much larger proportion of our Canadian waters under spatial protection, so as marine protected areas. This is something that our government has committed to in a very strong and very vocal way, putting it in the ministry's mandate letters, and I think that it's become quite public that we are moving in a very positive direction towards increasing the amount of marine protected areas that we have in Canada. What has been less well covered is that there is another Aichi target, target number 6, which is to actually rebuild marine populations. And we need to have as firm a commitment for that target as we do for target 11, the spatial protections. And that's something that we haven't really seen from this government. But I would say is equally important, or perhaps more important, especially for those endangered species. Yes, they need habitat, they need spatial protections, but really what we want to be doing, or one of the points of that spatial protection, is to actually increase the population abundances so that we're actually recovering those populations. And I think I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Julia. So it sounds like there's a lot of challenges right now with the current species at risk process, but some opportunities there to improve it, and perhaps a little bit of movement from what we'd seen a number of years ago. So I wanted to now launch into a case study on bluefin tuna, because I think it presents some of these challenges, and as well as some of the opportunities moving forward for this process. So just to give you a little bit of a background on bluefin tuna, so bluefin tuna were assessed by COSEWIC, so the scientific body that assesses marine species at risk in Canada, as endangered in 2011. And the reason behind this endangered status designation was that the population had undergone a 69% decline over just 3 generations. But what we found in May 3rd of 2017, so 6 years later, so speaking to the long lag time here, the Canadian government did make the final decision not to list bluefin tuna on Canada's Species at Risk Act. And again, speaking to some of Alan's points, they mainly cited socioeconomic impacts as the rationale, and not a lot of other rationale listed. But interestingly, because there was such a long lag period of 6 years in between the original assessment and the final decision, there were a number of changes, some to the status of the stock, as well as to domestic policy around species at risk, which again does present some interesting opportunities and challenges. So I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Andre Bustani, who can give us a little bit about the current science of bluefin tuna, as well as maybe some of the current challenges or what still needs to be done in terms of rebuilding bluefin tuna. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Bustani.
Thank you. Yeah, so with, and everyone can hear me? Okay. With bluefin tuna, like you said, they suffered a pretty dramatic decline, mainly starting probably in the 60s into the 70s, and then kind of bottomed out in the 80s. Bounced around on those low levels for, the following 20, 30 years or so. The last few assessments that we've done, we've seen, due to some conservation measures, a slight uptick in the population, at least in Western Atlantic bluefin tuna. Eastern Atlantic bluefin tuna, they also had a similar problem. So there's two populations of bluefin tuna in the Atlantic Ocean, one in the east that spawns primarily in the Mediterranean, one in the west that spawns primarily in the Gulf of Mexico and adjacent seas. But those kind of followed, similar trajectories where there was rampant overfishing for a while. Conservation measures were put in place. They bounced around in the West for quite a while before we saw any sort of uptick. And dealing just in general, when dealing with fisheries management, one of the things you're trying to do is manage risk. And that comes down to a management decision made by managers and not necessarily scientists as to how much risk they're willing to deal with, how much risk they're comfortable with. And as Julie was saying, uncertainty can add to that risk. Uncertainty is either scientific uncertainty. In the case of bluefin tuna, there's quite a bit of the biology that we still don't understand that can add to the risk, add to the uncertainty, and makes us a little bit less sure of, or even in some cases, a lot less sure of, what the true health of the population is. And some of those areas of uncertainty, which can increase risk for Atlantic bluefin tuna, are the rate of mixing between the two populations that I mentioned before. So how many eastern fish come over into the Western Atlantic, and how many of those are caught in both the Eastern and Western Atlantic. So mixing rates between the populations can really change the results of the assessment quite a bit. Age of spawning, so how old the fish is before it starts spawning and what the spawning output is for each individual age. Growth rates, there's some uncertainty around growth rates of Atlantic bluefin tuna as well. And one of the most important things that we don't tend to think about a lot in terms of, if you're just a biologist, but it's really important for stock assessment, is the relationship between the number of adult fish per unit adult biomass. A more productive stock is going to produce a lot more young fish per unit of adult biomass than a less productive stock would. And those change the outputs of the assessment quite a bit, and there's a lot of uncertainty around those, particularly in Western Atlantic bluefin tuna. One of the difficult things in trying to nail down what is the status of the stock for bluefin tuna, for Western Atlantic bluefin tuna and for Eastern Atlantic bluefin tuna, is a lot of the assessment is based on what we call fisheries dependent data. So we look at catch and effort rates over time, and that will try to give us some idea of what the health of the underlying stock is. Particularly what we're interested in is trajectories, whether that stock is increasing or decreasing. And that's usually measured in increasing or decreasing catch rates over time from commercial fisheries. One of the problems with that is that fisheries change over time as well, and spatial distribution or timing of effort can change quite a bit, and trying to correct for that can be problematic. This has been a little bit problematic, specifically in the case of Western Atlantic bluefin tuna and Canadian fisheries as well, mainly the Gulf of St. Lawrence, around PEI and Nova Scotia, where they moved to an individual quota system where it's called a catch card system, where individual vessels have a number of fish that they can bring in each year, and that allows them to fish a lot more efficiently than would an open system where everyone tries to go out and race and get the fish. And what that does is it makes catch per unit effort seem higher. And so trying to correct for that is one of the areas of uncertainty that we try to nail down during the stock assessment. Canada has recently implemented a fisheries independent survey using the herring acoustic survey that's been going on for a number of years. You can actually pick out, and this is done by DFO, you can actually pick out individual bluefin tuna in amongst the herring. As you're trying to get an assessment of the herring, you can also pick out individual bluefin tuna, and that gives you an idea of whether or not the number of bluefin tuna that you're measuring in that survey has been increasing or decreasing over time. And it appears as though they're increasing slowly, which is what we would expect, very long-lived fish with a very long-lived, long generation time. And, you know, it's not a very dynamic population. They can recover quickly if we give them the decrease in fishing pressure that they would need to do that. But generally, you don't want to decrease fishing pressure too much because of the socioeconomic effects that we talked about before. And so we've seen, you know, what appears to be a slow regrowth. How much effort we want to put into getting that to be a faster regrowth is one of the questions. And then ultimately, you know, what is the regrowth target? So for the population, what's the target that we want to get back to? These are all questions for, you know, both managers and scientists to figure out. Managers can run the assessments, but they really can't accurately say what level of risk we're comfortable with. And so those are some of the uncertainties for Atlantic bluefin tuna. A lot of those probably pertain to a lot of other fish stocks as well, which is why it is a good case study. All of these issues, most assessments for marine fish species are done in a similar way, using fisheries-dependent data. There's always uncertainty, particularly with fish species, because they live their lives underwater and you can't directly observe them, for some of these basic life history parameters that are very, very important for determining the health of fish stocks and running the assessment. So I'll leave it at that unless anyone has further questions later on. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Andre. So at the Ecology Action Center, you know, part of our job is to hold the government accountable to responsible fisheries management. And bluefin tuna is one of the species that we work on, and it's definitely been one that that a lot of the Canadian public has had questions about. You know, with it being assessed as endangered in 2011, but then talks about, you know, what is the current science saying, and so it was really useful to have a bit of an overview of that. You know, basically that there has been a slight increase since the original assessment has been done, but as you said, there's a lot of complications and a lot of uncertainty in the science. So from the, you know, from our view, we're sort of not in the clear yet. And so what I wanted to speak a little bit about are what we see as some new opportunities to make sure that we're continuing to manage bluefin tuna responsibly, because we don't feel that the Species at Risk Act is the end of the road. As Julia mentioned, there's a number of policies that we have in place that we should be using throughout the process, you know, not just when a species is assessed as at risk or listed or not listed. So I mentioned between the time that bluefin were originally assessed in 2011 to the time that they were, the government decided not to list them in 2017, there was a new policy that came into place. So in 2013, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans enacted a policy called the Species at Risk Act listing policy and directive for do not list advice. And bluefin tuna is actually the first case study or the first species that's going to be subject to that advice. And what this policy says is that essentially if a species is not going to be listed on the Species at Risk Act, then the department must come up with a justification for why it wouldn't be listed, a rationale, and then explain what measures it's going to take instead of using the Species at Risk Act to improve and recover the species. So in the Canada Gazette decision, where this decision around not listing bluefin tuna was listed, the government did present a rationale as to why it wasn't listing bluefin. As I mentioned, it was largely socioeconomic, and then it did present a bit of a a work plan as to what they would be doing to recover the species instead of the Species at Risk Act. We generally found that what they listed as the measures that they would be taking were inadequate. The directive or the new policy says that these measures should be done in addition to what's already been doing, so it should be measures that are not just the status quo. And from what we could tell so far, those measures didn't seem to be anything new. So what we're looking for the government to do is to make sure that it does continue to try to recover bluefin tuna. And some of the ways that we recommend that the government do that, one is actually just following our own precautionary approach and our own sustainable fisheries framework. We have a lot of the right tools in place that we can use, but they're not always being implemented. So we'd like to see that being implemented in full in a more real way than it currently is. We have outdated management plans and other things like that. Another thing that we're looking for Canada to do that we think it can achieve in terms of helping to recover bluefin and show that it's committed to species at risk that are not listed is to be a global leader in the adoption of modern best practices in fisheries management. And again, we have some of these kinds of policies already listed in our domestic management. Because bluefin tuna are managed not only domestically, but actually through an international body, Canada has an opportunity to share some of these best practices. We also recognize that bluefin are part of a complex ecosystem, and DFO has policies around considering the ecosystem, but currently is not really looking at the impact of the ecosystem on bluefin tuna or the bluefin's impact on the rest of the ecosystem. So that's another recommendation that we have. And lastly, we think that DFO needs to improve its on-water monitoring of bluefin tuna. At the moment, there's some efforts to account for how much bluefin we're taking out, but largely they're not adequate. So I guess in summary, we see the fact that bluefin tuna weren't listed and the fact that this new policy says that, well, this isn't the end of the road. The department is still subject to putting together a work plan, taking next steps in terms of recovering the species as an opportunity, but we want to make sure that the right steps are taken and it's not just the same old and not actually making improvements, because otherwise what we'll see is that it's just subject to this sort of long process of going through assessment with no additional measures taken. So I think I'll stop it there and maybe first see if there's any questions, and then I can also offer the panel any opportunities for wrap up. So I'm just looking at the questions here. The question was the decision to switch over to a per vessel quota, mostly an ICAT requirement or solely a DFO decision? I don't know if you know the answer to that, Andre.
Yeah, that was done. That was a Canadian decision. That was not an ICAT decision, and that was specifically to increase fishing efficiency and spread the catch out over a longer time period, because they were getting into a situation where everyone was bringing their fish to market at the same time, and it was driving the price down. And so they wanted to spread that catch out over a longer time period.
Great, thank you. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to write them into the comment box, and they get passed on to me.
Could I pose a question?
Sure.
Yeah. So regarding the quota allocation for bluefin tuna, I understand that Canada has accepted unfished quota from both Mexico and Japan, and has gone ahead and caught the fish, as opposed to setting that aside for conservation purposes. I just wanted to get that confirmed, if that's what I'm hearing is correct.
Yeah, Mexico has transferred quota to Canada for a number of years, and that's generally been caught by Canada. Mexico has quota. They're not allowed to have targeted bluefin fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico, which is a spawning ground. And so they generally don't use their quota, and they have, what you call excess quota that's generally been transferred to Canada, and Canada has catches.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not aware of I'm not aware of any quota from Japan being transferred to Canada.
Okay, so just Mexico. So obviously
Yeah.
that's one area that the Canadian government could be a little more proactive if you know, if they get quota from somebody else and then simply don't catch it. You know, that would invest in the future of the species, I would think. And I had one other question regarding the abundance indices for the stock assessment. I thought there was one fishery independent index, which was a larval survey in the Gulf of Mexico. And I believe the time trend in that one is completely different from what the biomass index is coming out of the assessment. Basically, it's been flat for many years, and whereas the stock assessment is indicating a recent increase in abundance. So I'm just wondering if that's still the case.
Yes, sorry, and I didn't mention that fishery independent survey. That's a fishery independent survey that's been going on a long time, and basically that's a larval index, and so they'll tow nets behind a boat in the Gulf of Mexico, and you know, look at the number of larvae, and that gives you you know, some sort of indication of the number of spawning fish. But yes, that one has remained flat for a long period of time, similar to the stock of adult biomass. That one is also seen what appears to be an increase in the most recent years. And so that might be increasing along with the increase in the larger fish biomass. And the increases have not been to the same extent that some of the other indices have been, particularly the Gulf of St. Lawrence Index in Canada. That one's seen perhaps the biggest increases. And I think part of that was probably due to the switch to an individual quota system, which made fishing much more efficient and increased the catch per unit effort. You're seeing an increase, but not an increase to that extent in the fisheries independent surveys, whether that be the larval surveys or the new herring acoustic surveys, where they're also now able to assess Atlantic bluefin tuna at the same time. So.
Thanks. We do have another question from the comments. So the question is, and I think this could be maybe Alan or Julia, and then I could answer it as well, but when socioeconomic impact is assessed in terms of a listing decision, do they look only at short-term impacts, or do they forecast and incorporate medium and long-term socioeconomic impacts as well?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. All I've ever seen in the socioeconomic argument in the non-listing decision is accounting for foregone catch revenue, and it would be in the short term. There is no attempt to factor in the benefits of taking management actions that would in fact lead to rebuilding the population. They're not there. Nobody's tried to estimate them. It's simply foregone revenue for catch that wouldn't be realized. And it also does not take into account the permitting abilities under SARA, where incidental harm can be permitted. And in fact, it was done for these wolffish species that were grandfathered in under SARA because COSEWIC had assessed them before the act was proclaimed. So anything that was like on, you know, either threatened or endangered was grandfathered under SARA. And there were permitting exercises undertaken. But there's been no attempt to do that for any other marine fish that I'm aware of.
I don't know, do you looked at that in your studies at all, Julia?
Yeah, so I would agree completely with Alan, and just add to that the socioeconomic evaluations that are being undertaken are not very sophisticated at all. There's a number of points here. What's been shown is that if an at-risk marine fish has any economic value currently, I mean, if it's even bringing in $1 of value, it basically won't be listed. And so as Alan said, what's not being taken into account is the cost-benefit analysis. So right now, if anyone is fishing that fish, then it has socioeconomic value, and sort of the flag's been put up and said, well, we can't possibly list it because some fishermen will be impacted. But what's not being taken into account is, yes, there might be some economic benefit to continuing to fish that fish at the present time, versus how much more economic benefit might we have down the line if we rein things in for a few years, allow the population to recover, such that it is much more abundant, and then you could actually be catching more of them once the population is larger. I mean, that probably is going to have much more economic benefit, but of course it requires some economic loss in the short term to have that long-term gain. And it's always the difficulty of getting through that short-term sacrifice, which is going to be a real sacrifice for people out there, and it's impacting their livelihoods and their jobs. And so I understand that, and I don't want to say this lightly, but we're not taking into account the longer-term benefits, both the longer-term economic benefits and, of course, the longer-term conservation benefits to the fact that these species do more than just provide fish to us. They also provide or serve other roles in the broader ecosystem. And so I think it's really short-sighted. The other point just to make there is that, I mean, these socioeconomic evaluations are, as I said, not sophisticated at all. I mean, I can't even say that they're analyses. There are no cost-benefit analyses being done. And this really stands apart from the way that the scientific work is done. So the scientific work is done, and then it is peer reviewed. So it is sent out for other people, experts in the field, to evaluate. There is no peer evaluation of the socioeconomic analysis that's being done. And so I think there's a real opportunity here for some more sophisticated analyses to be done, and to really think through what are the costs and the benefits, and how does that differ from the short term and the long term.
Great, thank you so much. So it sounds like, the title of this panel is around the path forward, and I remember hearing one of the strong recommendations from both Alan and Julia was around the lag time and making sure that there's a legal requirement to make these decisions a lot quicker. Another strong recommendation seems to be around the idea of improving the robustness of the socioeconomic analyses, both in terms of looking at current impact, but also projecting forward in terms of what would be the impact of if you actually rebuilt the stock, what would be the benefits of that. So I don't see any more questions. So I'm wondering whether anybody else has anything to wrap up. Maybe I can just go through the order of the panel again. And if you have any closing thoughts, please feel free to share them. So we'll start with Alan.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this. It's been nice. It's been really nice to see Julia again, even though she just lives down the road. But anyway, we're on the same island. We should get together. I just wanted to make one more comment about recommendations, and I alluded to it briefly in my presentation. But we're currently doing status evaluations for Pacific salmon, notably Chinook and sockeye salmon. And so now we're looking specifically at assessments that DFO is doing relative to the wild Pacific salmon policy. And like I said, that policy makes explicit comment about COSEWIC status, in that there's a zone that they call red, which in groundfish jargon we might call critical. And part of the boundary definition for that is that species that are in the red zone would basically, anything that was assessed by COSEWIC to be either threatened or endangered would fall into this red zone. And so when they're doing their metrics of status for Pacific salmon, they are using the COSEWIC status criteria. And that's unique within DFO. For groundfish, certainly anything on the east coast of Canada, COSEWIC basically doesn't exist. But we do have this precautionary approach management framework that has 3 zones: critical, cautious, and healthy. The critical zone clearly would include anything assessed by COSEWIC as either threatened or endangered. And I think it would be a very simple thing to make the COSEWIC criteria, just integrate them into that precautionary approach framework as just a simple matter of doing business. The criteria are well understood, they're internationally accepted, they have strong validity in conservation biology. And as I alluded to in my presentation, many of our members in our subcommittee and also the co-chairs of this committee have huge experience doing stock assessments for COSEWIC and have absolutely no trouble interpreting the criteria that are used. They're different than fisheries management criteria, but they serve a valid purpose and they're quite understandable and they're in the public domain. So that would be my other recommendation to add to your list, Kate.
Great, thank you so much. Julia, any closing comments?
Yeah, several closing comments and additional recommendations, just adding to the list, the great list that Alan started. So we've talked about the need to make faster decisions, and I just want to reiterate that it's not, or sort of flesh that out a little bit, that it's not just that we need to make faster decisions about whether or not to list our species at risk, but also that we need to make faster, where we need to implement conservation measures faster. So it takes many years to even get a decision as to whether or not species should be listed on SARA, but then it also takes several years before any actions are put in place. And so what we find overall is that from the time a species is assessed as being at risk to the time that it receives any additional conservation or management measures, it's actually 5 years. And for a number of species, it's much longer, and the species that it tends to be longer for are the ones that are endangered or threatened, so most in need of management action. For some of those endangered species, it's been between 8 and 10 years before anything happens. And so this is absolutely ludicrous. I mean, it's akin to calling the fire department and saying that your house is on fire, and then the firemen sitting around and deliberating for 3 weeks as to whether or not they should go and put out the fire. So we obviously need to fix the speed. And so one of the huge recommendations that I would have there is that as soon as we know that a species is assessed as being at risk by COSIWIC, so that's a scientific peer-reviewed assessment, then additional management measures need to be put in place even while we're waiting for a SARA decision. There's no reason that we should, from that point forward, be sitting around doing nothing. We know that the species is in trouble. A DFO could be putting additional management measures in place right from the get-go while we wait for a formal decision as to whether or not it is going to be managed by the Species at Risk Act or continue to be managed by DFO. Couple of other points is that, again, we need those timelines to be legally binding. I would say that we need enhanced transparency. We found from analyses that there's been a huge problem with lack of transparency at DFO, whether it's stock assessments not being accessible, not being available, and a huger problem is that DFO management decisions are not publicly available, or at least were not in the past. I think our new government has made transparency a real priority, and I know that they're doing a lot of things to enhance transparency, and so I want to applaud that and say that we need to keep moving down that road to improve transparency. And then finally, I would say another recommendation is that we need to actually evaluate if the management measures that we get in place, assuming that we are going to improve the conservation and management measures that we're putting in place for at-risk species, we need to have clear ways of evaluating if those management measures are in fact promoting the recovery of the at-risk marine species.
Thank you, a really great list there. Andre, anything to add?
I just wanted to circle back around to something that Julia mentioned earlier that I think is really important, where she talked about not only you have to manage for the economics of what impact decreasing quota or any other sort of conservation measure is going to have on the present fishers, but also on what the future impacts are going to be on future fishers. And that's one thing that often gets lost in the debate of marine conservation, especially conservation of commercially fished species, is it's not really so much of a debate between, or an argument or a balance between fish and fishers. It's oftentimes a debate between fishers now and fishers in the future, where you can optimize revenue at a later time, but often that means foregoing some revenue now. And that's one of the big debates, how much you want to forego now to see how much you can get in the future, beyond even just, ecological questions or the state of the stock. It's really an economic question of revenue now versus revenue later. And that's actually a really important point. And I just wanted to retouch on that one because I think it is so important.
Great, thank you very much. Those are a really great set of recommendations. I just wanted to mention again the work of the Ecology Action Centre. So we are closely monitoring the Species at Risk Act process in Canada. We sit on a national committee of stakeholders from industry and NGOs and government that looks at how to make improvements to the Species at Risk process. So we'll be continuing to engage and hopefully bring some of these recommendations forward through that body. And on the bluefin tuna front, we really see bluefin tuna as an opportunity for the government to show that they're serious about recovering species, even if they don't list them on Species at Risk Act. There'll be a big meeting in November wherein the Government of Canada and other governments managing bluefin tuna are going to be deciding on the new allowable catch for bluefin for the next couple of years, as well as a number of other management measures. And we'll be attending on behalf of civil society and representing the environmental voice at those meetings. And so we'll be looking to make sure that that more is done. And so if anybody's interested in learning more about that work, please let us know. You can contact us through our website or through our Twitter, which is at EAC_marine. But thank you everybody for listening. This was the first endeavor in doing a live panel, so looking for feedback as well. But it's been really informative and hopefully interesting for everyone. So thank you again to the panel members.
Thank you.
Thanks.